Okay, hello everyone. My name is Marlena Baldauf. I'm a doctorate student at the University of Regensburg, and in my contribution to the symposium, I will be presenting our work on resonance frequencies in developing brains. Specifically, we investigated rhythmic visual properties in infant brains, and by the end of this talk, I hope to have demonstrated that infant brains tick in theta and adult brains tick in alpha. So let me show you how we got to that conclusion. We're going to start off, okay, we're not, by addressing the question of why it is interesting to study neural oscillations. So decades of research have suggested that the brain operates in rhythms, and these patterns of rhythmic electrical activity are generated within and across cell assemblies, and they're called neural oscillations. Studying these neural oscillations allows us insights into the coordination and the integration of distributed brain processes. Typically, we assess oscillations with an EEG. The data would look a little bit something like this. And what we can then do is we can decompose this type of signal into the time and the frequency components. This results typically look like this. So this is a time frequency plot with time on the x-axis and the frequency on the y-axis, and then the amplitude is coded in color. Essentially, this gives us information about which frequency is present to what extent at a given time point. So typically, individual frequencies are grouped together in so-called frequency bands, and these frequency bands are associated with various cognitive processes. Here are some of the sort of classical findings in adults. The theta rhythm, which is 4 to 8 hertz, is typically associated with learning. It's an active learning frequency band, amongst other things. And then the alpha frequency band, that's 8 to 12 hertz, is typically associated with attention in adults. Now, of course, as developmental researchers, we would like to know how this oscillatory landscape develops. And that's where a really interesting study by Cellier and colleagues from 2021 comes into play. The authors investigated the dominant frequency, so the one that's most pronounced, in participants from early childhood into adulthood. And you can see the results here. Again, we have, so in this case, we have age on the x-axis and the dominant frequency on the y-axis. And you can see this progression with age into higher frequencies. The key finding essentially is that we have this distinction, right? That in adults, the alpha rhythm is the dominant frequency at rest. However, in early childhood, the theta rhythm is the dominant frequency at rest. And while this is really exciting initial evidence about how the oscillatory landscape develops at rest, an open question remains of what happens when the brain, or the infant brain, responds to stimulation, external stimulation. One way to systematically investigate operating frequencies following stimulation is through rhythmic visual stimulation. So essentially, we want to study the rhythmic properties of an oscillating system, and in order to do so, we perturbate it and see what happens, what the response is following this perturbation. What's often been done in developmental studies so far is that a periodic input is presented, and the oscillatory response is observed. And this allows us to draw inferences about resonance, which is the oscillatory response upon perturbation. In adults, RVS has been used to establish alpha as the inherent operating frequency in the brain. There are two studies that are very relevant in this context, the first one being by Hermann from 2001, that used rhythmic visual stimulation to study resonance properties in the adult brain. So in this experiment, adults were presented with flickering lights and frequencies ranging from 1 hertz to 100 hertz in 1 hertz steps. And the results are illustrated here. So we have the stimulation frequency on the y-axis and the response frequency on the x-axis, and there are a couple of interesting findings that emerge here, right? So the first one is that there's a response at the fundamental frequency. That means that the brain mirrors the frequency it was stimulated in. So in this case, if the adult brain was stimulated at 6 hertz, it responds at 6 hertz also. Hermann also found several harmonics, so these are multiple integers of the stimulation frequency. For example, for 6 hertz, the brain would respond also in 12 hertz and 18 hertz. There's subharmonics, so that's a fraction of the stimulation frequency. In the case of 6 hertz, that's 3 hertz. But most excitingly, a consistent 10 hertz response phenomenon emerged. That is, not only was the response to 10 hertz the largest, but it was also that 10 hertz, there was a 10 hertz response to stimulation frequencies that weren't multiples of 10. There's a second study by Van Rollen and McDonald from 2012 that corroborates this notion of alpha as crucial frequency in information processing. So adult participants were presented with white noise sequences that are stimulus sequences or light sequences that are tailored to have a flat frequency spectrum. So it's not like one frequency is particularly dominant, but they're all present equally strong. The authors then cross-correlated these vectors or luminance signals that they presented adult participants with the EEG that they took from them. In cross-correlation, what we essentially do is we take the two signals, so the EEG and the luminance signal, and shift them with respect to one another, and then calculate to what extent the two overlap. And you can see the results for two exemplary subjects here in gray. As you can see, quite clearly there's a 10 Hertz response that emerges. That is, the signal repeats itself at a rate of 10 times per second. So taken together, both the Hermann study I just showed and the Van Rollen and McDonald study revealed that alpha is an inherent frequency in information processing. However, we asked ourselves, okay, how does this translate to infants? Do infants show these resonance phenomena? And if so, do they also show them in alpha like adults, or would they be in a different frequency? We expected that perhaps that would be theta, because we've seen that that's a dominant frequency in infants. This is how we sought out to investigate this. We presented infants with cartoon monsters. We had a final sample of 42 subjects that were 7 to 9 months old, and we presented them with rhythmic visual stimulation in 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 15, 20, and 30 hertz, and we also presented white noise sequences, so the ones with the flat frequency spectrum. Let us now have a look at the results. So starting off with the rhythmic visual stimulation trials, we used a fast Fourier transformation to transform the EEG signal into the frequency space. And here are the results from a posterior cluster of electrodes. So a couple of interesting findings again. Here we found a significant fundamental response, so stimulation in 6 hertz led to a 6 hertz response. We also found significant harmonics for significant first and second harmonics for all stimulation frequencies except 2 hertz. Lastly, what's most interesting in my opinion is that we found a consistent 4 hertz response phenomenon. That is, no matter what we stimulated the infant brain in, it responded with 4 hertz. Let us now go to the white noise trials. We investigated these similarly to Van Rollen and McDonald's. That is, we cross-correlated the EEG signal with the luminance vector we had presented at that specific trial to estimate the so-called impulse response function. And you can see that here in red. So as you can see, a 4 hertz response emerges, suggesting that the signal in the infant brain repeats itself at a rate of 4 times per second. We could consider this the 4 hertz echo. To make sure that this echo is not just an artifact of basic visual property processing, we also took a given luminance signal and cross-correlated it with a shuffled EEG trial, so to have this sort of surrogate distribution. And that's what you can see in blue. And as you can see, the 4 hertz echo vanishes. So it's the specific information of that trial that is repeated. This becomes even more clear when we look at the time frequency representation. The top is the matching and the bottom is the surrogate, so the shuffled ones. And here you can see the difference. We tested whether the difference at 4 hertz between the two conditions is significantly different, and that is indeed the case. Lastly, you can here see the topography of the impulse response function. It's quite a widespread effect where we find the theta echo occurring frontally and parieto-occipitally. And we very recently, in our last step of this analysis, are also doing this with adults. So we're presenting adults with our cartoon monsters flickered at certain frequencies and white noise sequences. We only very recently started testing the first adults, so this is very preliminary results from 3 adults. And what's exciting is that we don't really have this 4 hertz power increase, but what we do have is an 8 hertz, which is alpha power increase following stimulation in all stimulation frequencies. So, to summarize, the alpha rhythm is an inherent rhythmic property of information processing in adults. In infants, however, the theta rhythm is an inherent rhythmic property of information processing. The question that arises naturally, of course, is now what is the functionality of this shift? There's multiple or 2 possible interpretations that I would like to present. The first one is that infant theta eventually becomes adult alpha. That is, sort of infant theta speeds up, so the information processing speeds up to become adult alpha. So they're essentially functionally equivalent. This finding could be made based on the resting state study I presented earlier. Our understanding, however, is leaning more towards a second interpretation, which is that infant theta actually is the same as, or the same functionally equivalent to adult theta. That is the finding that infants recruit theta and adults recruit alpha is because they recruit different operating strategies. This interpretation is based on findings investigating the functionality of the theta rhythm. We know that both in adults and infants, building novel representations is associated with theta, and theta has ascribed this integrative function. An example come from violation of expectations studies. So for example, this one by Köster and al. From 2021. The paradigm is depicted in the top panel. Infants were presented with an action that either had an expected or an unexpected outcome. So in one case, the brezel was eaten, in another case, the man puts it to his ear. And what we can see in this study and other studies is that we find an increase in theta in response to an unexpected event. So the infants, when they see that something unexpected is happening, theta in their brain goes up. And we find, importantly, exactly the same finding in adults. If an adult encounters a situation where novel information is encountered, their theta power increases. So, taken together, as I said, the alpha rhythm plays a key role in information processing in adults. And this might be possibly due to their reliance on established cortical networks during information processing. Infants, however, rely on theta, which is supposedly a learning mechanism. So perhaps that is the case because infants are constantly sampling new information to set up the established cortical networks that we see in adults. Yeah, and that's the end of my talk. Thank you so much for your attention. I would like to thank my supervisor and our collaborator Ole Jensen and our great student assistants and of course all the participating families.
Thank you very much, Marlena. Questions?
Thank you for presenting this very nice work. Kind of building on your final slide and your suggested explanations, could you remind me what age range you worked with?
Oh, sorry, I should have said that. So these were 7 to 9 month old infants.
So have you thought about exploring a wider range of ages and empirically testing whether you're seeing a shift from fundamental theta to alpha, or whether you're like a step change versus like a sort of a more nuanced, like slopey kind of shift?
Yeah, I think that would be super interesting to investigate. So as I mentioned, what we're doing now is we're testing the adults first to see whether we also find this dichotomy. But the Selye and al. Study I presented first, they find that the switch happens around 7 years. So it'd be interesting to see how sort of in this more information processing situation, when the transition takes place. And in order to do so, we would have to investigate sort of more a continuum of ages. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So this is very cool work. I was wondering about, so okay, given the functional explanation,
right?
There's two aspects to that. One is the one you already talked about, which is the transition based on age. But it shouldn't just be a general transition based on age. It should be a transition based on the familiarity of a given input as well. So what you should be able to find is that the alpha shift happens earlier, and for example, if you expose them to to native language versus an unfamiliar language, and things like this. So do you know any findings in the literature like that? Is that prediction in line with the account that you're making?
That's an interesting point. So in this case, we didn't focus as much on sort of the content of what was actually processed. So the claim I'm making is more about the maturity of the cortical network, as opposed to sort of what specifically the infants were presented with or what type of information was investigated. Also, mind you, this is visual processing. So I wouldn't know how this translates to sort of speech processing, which is more auditory based, because I know in adults, the echo I presented is not found for auditory information.
Okay, but then even in visual processing, you would expect a difference between things that they're very familiar to them. You would expect this shift towards alpha might happen sooner if they were presented with images that were familiar to them, maybe not in infancy, but say at 4 or 5 years rather than 7 years, as opposed to objects that were unfamiliar to them.
I agree. I think that's a sort of very plausible hypothesis. It would be really interesting to extend this more by other dimensions, such as familiarity. I think that might be the case indeed, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great talk.
Thank you.
I'm here. Hi.
Oh.
Yeah, no worries. So when you, in your plot where you found your constant theta response in the infants,
Yes.
it looked to me like maybe you also had some higher frequency kind of vertical line, although less strong. So I don't know if I'm correct about that at all.
Sorry, this is the adult data.
So like there's like a more fading sort of bend afterwards. Do you think that might be alpha and that it might shift to that later? Or do you think it might be a harmonic or something? Or is that something you looked at all?
So you're referring to the one that's about 6 hertz, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell.
Yeah,
what it
I
is,
think
but yeah.
I believe that's at 6 to 7 hertz, so it would probably be a little bit low for alpha still. I haven't really looked at sort of what that would be, but it's an interesting point. Thank you. I'll keep it in mind and check what's going on there.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Maybe one more quick question, if there is one.
Hi. You make a task-related claim, so that you find these 4 hertz, 8 hertz simulation like frequencies because of the task processing. But are you actually like comparing it to baseline or anything? Because I was thinking, if they say, you know, in resting state activity, we find this 4 and 8 hertz activity, then maybe what you're finding here is just like the rest of the brain that is resting or whatever, or the general frequency that the brain is having, not necessarily making it a task-related frequency change.
Well, I mean, okay, so it's not task-related in the sense that we have sort of different behavioral outcomes or we're trying to infer functionality. The sort of functional explanation I gave in the end is based on other literature, so I'm not really making that claim based on our findings. I think the echo, so this part sort of, makes, here we go. So if this was just general processing or resting state or anything, we wouldn't find this type of echo. So our surrogate distribution would also show this type of echo, right? Because that's sort of the baseline of, not the baseline, but what's going on in the brain. But we don't find it. So this is actually closely tied to the information that we're presenting. Otherwise, the cross-correlation wouldn't look like this. So I think we can quite confidently say that it's the actual information that's represented here, based on the way we calculate it.
All right. Thank you once more, Marlena.
Thank you.